On my 71st birthday, I got a card in the mail from a man I sent to prison. That alone would have been strange. Judges don't get birthday wishes from the people they lock away. But this card was worse than strange. It was impossible, because the man who signed it in handwriting I would have known anywhere had been dead for 18 years. I held that envelope in my hands at the kitchen counter, and I felt the floor tilt under me, because the dead do not send birthday cards. And if Daniel Hollis was alive, then everything I believed about the worst decision of my life was a lie. Let me start at the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before that card found me. My name is Edward Calloway. For 34 years, I sat on the bench in Merrill County, a small place tucked into the hills where everybody knew everybody, and the courthouse was the tallest building for 40 miles. I was the kind of judge people called fair, which in a town like ours meant I was hard but predictable. I believed in the law the way some men believe in God. I believed that if you followed the procedure, if you weighed the evidence, if you kept your own feelings out of it, you would arrive at the truth. The truth was a destination, and the law was the road that got you there. I believed that for most of my life. I retired 6 years ago. My wife Margaret passed 2 winters back, and since then the house had grown quiet in a way I never got used to. My days had a shape to them, but no weight. I made coffee, I read the paper, I walked to the end of the road and back. I waited for a phone that rarely rang. My daughter Caroline called on Sundays from 3 states away, and I told her I was fine, and she pretended to believe me. And that was the arrangement we had. So when the mail came that morning, and there was a real envelope in it, hand-addressed, I felt something almost like excitement. People don't write letters anymore. The handwriting was careful, slanted. The letters formed with a kind of patience you don't see often. The return corner was blank, the postmark was smeared, but I could make out part of a town name. It wasn't local. I opened it standing right there at the counter, coffee going cold beside me. It was a birthday card, a cheap one, the kind you buy from a drugstore rack, a watercolor of a sunrise on the front, and the words, "Another year, another blessing," printed inside in gold. Underneath the printed words, somebody had written by hand, "Happy birthday, Your Honor. I never stopped thinking about that day. Neither did you, I'd guess. There are things you don't know. When you're ready to know them, you will. D.H." I read it 3 times. The letters D.H. didn't mean anything to me for a moment, the way your own name sometimes looks foreign if you stare at it too long. And then they did mean something, and my whole body went cold, the way water goes cold the deeper you sink. Daniel Hollis. I had not said that name out loud in 18 years, but I had thought it more times than I could count. He was the only man I ever sentenced who I could not forget. Not because of what he did, because of the way he looked at me when I read the verdict. Not angry, not afraid, just steady, like a man watching a storm come in over a field he can't leave. He looked at me like he knew something I didn't, and for 18 years that look had lived in the back of my mind like a splinter you can feel, but can't find. Daniel Hollis was convicted in my courtroom of killing a man named Russell Pike. And 4 years into a life sentence, Daniel Hollis died in the state penitentiary. I knew that for a fact. I had seen it. It had been in the paper. A note had even crossed my desk, the way those things do in a small county. A formality. Inmate deceased. Cause, cardiac event. Case closed in the most permanent way a case can close. Dead men don't write birthday cards. I set the card down on the counter and I stepped back from it like it might move. My heart was going hard and uneven. I told myself there was an explanation. Somebody knew the case. Somebody was playing a cruel joke on a lonely old man. A relative, maybe, still carrying a grudge after all these years. There were 100 explanations that didn't require the dead to walk. But here's the thing I couldn't get past: the handwriting. During the trial, Daniel Hollis had written me a letter. Defendants aren't supposed to, and I wasn't supposed to read it, and I gave it to his attorney like the rules required. But I read it first. I shouldn't have, but I did, because something about the man pulled at me. In that letter, he hadn't begged. He hadn't claimed innocence in the loud, desperate way the guilty often do. He had simply written, in that careful, slanted hand, "I think you are a man who wants to do right. I am asking you to look one more time before you decide. That is all I ask." I never forgot that handwriting, the way the letters leaned, the little flourish on the capital letters. And the card on my counter was written in the exact same hand. 18 years older, maybe, a little shakier, but the same hand. I would have staked my life on it. I picked up the card again and turned it over, looking for something, anything. On the back, in pencil so faint I almost missed it, was a single line of numbers, a phone number. I am an old man, and I am a careful man, and I want you to understand that I sat in my kitchen for the better part of an hour before I did anything at all. I made fresh coffee I didn't drink. I told myself to throw the card away. I told myself to call the sheriff. I told myself a dozen sensible things. And then I picked up the phone and I dialed the number. Because I have never in my life been able to leave a question unanswered. And the law had taught me that the only sin worse than asking is refusing to ask. It rang 4 times, then a click, and then a voice, low and rough with age, said, "Hello, Your Honor." I couldn't speak. I knew that voice. Older, sanded down, but I knew it. "It's you," I said finally. "It can't be you." "It's me," he said. "Take your time. I know this is a lot." "You're dead," I said. "I have the record. You died in '06. Cardiac event." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing. "That's what the record says," he said. "The record's been wrong about me before. You of all people should know that." I should have hung up. A sensible man would have hung up and called the authorities. But I am not, when it comes down to it, a sensible man. I am a curious one, and curiosity has always been stronger in me than fear. "Tell me how," I said. "Not on the phone," he said. "Some things you have to see. There's a diner off Route 9, the Blue Spruce, about 2 hours from you. I'll be there Thursday at noon. Come alone or don't come at all. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to be the man you said you were, the one who looks one more time." And then the line went dead. I sat there with the phone still in my hand for a long time. Thursday was 3 days away. I had 3 days to talk myself out of it, and I want to tell you I tried. But the truth is I knew from the moment he hung up that I was going to go. Because if there was any chance at all, that I had sent an innocent man to prison and then let the world believe he was dead, I needed to know, even if the knowing destroyed me. Let me tell you about the case, about Russell Pike and the night he died, and how I came to put Daniel Hollis away for the rest of his life. Russell Pike was not a man people mourned, and I'll be honest about that, because it matters to what came after. He owned half the businesses on Main Street and held the mortgages on the other half. He was the kind of man who smiled while he foreclosed on you. He bought land cheap from people who were desperate and sold it dear to people who weren't. In a county as poor as ours, he was the closest thing we had to a king. And like most kings, he was hated quietly and obeyed loudly. Daniel Hollis worked for him, did odd jobs, repairs, drove him around sometimes. Daniel was a quiet man, a widower, raising a young daughter on his own. He had a temper people knew about, the kind that flared and faded, and he and Pike had argued more than once. There was bad blood over money Pike owed him, wages held back, the usual cruelties a man like Pike inflicted on the people who depended on him. On a cold night in November, Russell Pike was found dead in his study, struck on the back of the head with a heavy brass paperweight. And Daniel Hollis was found, an hour later, on the road outside town, with blood on his sleeve and no good account of where he'd been. The evidence, when it came together neatly. Too neatly, I would think later, but at the time it seemed simply damning. Daniel's fingerprints were on the paperweight, though he'd cleaned that study 100 times, and his prints were on everything in the room. The blood on his sleeve was Pike's type, though they never matched it the way they could now. A neighbor said she'd seen Daniel's truck near the house that night. And there was the money. Pike had finally agreed to pay Daniel what he owed, and the payment in cash was missing from the safe. Daniel said he was innocent. He said Pike had called him that night to settle up, that he'd gone to the house, that Pike had given him the cash he was owed, and nothing more. That Pike had been alive and well when he left. He said the blood on his sleeve was from a dog he'd stopped to help on the road, a stray that had been hit by a car. He said he'd taken the dog to the only vet open late, but the vet had closed early that night, and Daniel had let the dog die in his arms by the roadside and buried it in the woods. There was no dog, there was no body found, there was no one to say he'd been anywhere but the scene of a murder. His story sounded, even to me, like the kind of thing a guilty man invents. A dying dog, a buried body no one could find, the convenient absence of any witness. I had heard 1,000 alibis, and I had learned that the truth is usually simple and a lie is usually elaborate. And Daniel's story, was elaborate. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. They came back guilty. And I, sitting where I sat, looked down at that man and saw what the evidence told me to see. A man who had killed his employer over money and tried to cover it with a story about a stray dog. I sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, which was within my discretion, and which I believed, at the time, was justice. And he looked at me with that steady look, and he said the only thing he said at sentencing. He said, "Someday you'll know, and I hope you can live with it when you do." And they took him away. 4 years later, he was dead, or so I believed. Now I was driving 2 hours to a diner called the Blue Spruce to meet a dead man. And the whole way there, I argued with myself about whether I was a fool or a coward or both. The Blue Spruce was a low building with a gravel lot and a sign that buzzed, even in daylight. I was 20 minutes early. I sat in my car and watched the door and felt my heart doing things a heart my age shouldn't do. At 11 minutes to noon, a man came out of the diner and stood by the door. And even from across the lot, even after 18 years, I knew him. He was old now, the way I was old. Thin, his hair had gone white and his face had folded into deep lines. But he stood the way he'd always stood, straight-backed, still, like a man who'd learned to wait. He saw my car and he didn't wave. He just watched me, the way he'd watched me from the defendant's table all those years ago. I got out and walked across the gravel, and my legs didn't feel like my own. "Your Honor," he said. "Daniel," I said. It was the first time I'd ever called him by his first name. In court, he'd always been the defendant, or Mr. Hollis, or the accused. Daniel, a man's name. "Buy you a cup of coffee?" he said, and something in the ordinariness of it nearly broke me. We sat in a corner booth. He ordered coffee for both of us and a slice of pie he didn't touch. And then he told me how a man comes to be dead and not dead at the same time. "There's a thing that happens in prison," he said, "that people on the outside don't know about. Men disappear. Not escape, disappear. The paperwork says one thing and the truth is another. A man gets transferred and the transfer never gets recorded right. A man dies and it's somebody else in the box. The system is so big and so old and so tired that things fall through it all the time. And some men learn how to make themselves fall through on purpose." "You're telling me you faked your death," I said. "I'm telling you I had help," he said. "I'm telling you that 4 years into a sentence I didn't earn, a man came to me with a deal. He could make Daniel Hollis die, and the man who walked out in Daniel Hollis's place would have a different name and a clean slate and a chance to spend whatever years he had left as a free man. All I had to do was agree to stay dead, stay gone, never come back to Merrill County. Never tell anyone." "Why would anyone do that?" I said. "Why would anyone go to that trouble for you?" And here Daniel Hollis looked at me and his eyes were wet and he said, "Because I knew who really killed Russell Pike, and the man who killed him would rather have me dead and gone than alive and talking. Dead men can't appeal. Dead men can't get DNA tests. Dead men can't stand up in a courtroom 18 years later and name a name. So he made me dead, and he was content to leave it there. For 18 years I let him. Because I was tired and I was scared, and being gone was easier than being a ghost that nobody believed." "Then why now?" I said. "Why come back now? Why the card?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm dying," he said simply. "For real this time. Doctor gave me months. And I find that a man who's actually dying loses his taste for staying quiet. I spent 18 years free, but not free. Free to walk around, but never free of that courtroom. Never free of your face when you read that sentence. And I decided that before I go, I want one person who matters to know the truth. Not a reporter, not a lawyer. You, the man who decided. Because the law put me away, Your Honor, but you were the law that day. And I think you've been carrying me around as long as I've been carrying you." He wasn't wrong. I had been. I felt the truth of it sitting in that booth, the weight I'd carried for 18 years suddenly having a face across the table from me. "Who killed Russell Pike?" I asked. "If you didn't, who did?" And Daniel Hollis told me a name, and that name went through me like a knife because it was a name I knew. It was a name everyone in Merrill County knew. And it was a name that, if true, meant that the murder of Russell Pike was not a crime of passion over withheld wages, but something planned, something protected, something that reached up into places I had trusted my whole life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before he gave me the name, Daniel Hollis told me about the dog. You remember the dog, he said. The stray, the one nobody believed in, the one that made my story sound like a lie. I remember, I said. It was real, he said. Everything I said that night was true. I helped Pike with his books, and that night he called me to pay me what he owed. And he did, and I left. And on the road home there was a dog. A young dog, somebody's hit and left to die. I stopped. I couldn't not stop. I'm a man who stops for dogs. And I held that animal while it died, and I got its blood on my sleeve. And I buried it in the trees because I couldn't stand to leave it on the road. And that was the truth. And the truth was what hanged me, because the truth had no witness, and the lie had a dozen. He reached into his coat and took out an envelope, soft with age, and slid it across the table. Inside was a photograph, faded, of a young girl, maybe 9 years old, holding a puppy. The same girl I dimly remembered from the trial, Daniel's daughter. That puppy grew up, he said. And 11 years after I went to prison, it died of old age in my daughter's backyard, 1,000 miles from here, in a town where she'd moved to start over after her father became a murderer. And before it died, my daughter had it tested, because she never stopped believing me. And the dog I buried that night by the road, the one nobody believed in, the one whose blood was on my sleeve, its kind, its breed, its blood markers, my daughter spent years tracking down what could have been proven if anyone had cared to dig where I said to dig. I didn't fully understand then what he was telling me. The dog had been dead and buried for 18 years, but I understood the shape of it. There had been a truth in the ground all that time that no one had bothered to look for, because the story was already neat, and a neat story is a closed story, and a closed story is one nobody reopens. I need you to understand, Daniel said, that I'm not here for revenge. I'm too tired and too sick for revenge. I'm here because there are two things in this world that I want before I die. I want my daughter to be able to say her father wasn't a murderer. And I want the man who let it happen, the man who knew, to look at me and account for it. And that man is still alive, Your Honor, and he's still powerful. And the only person who might believe me, the only person whose word might mean something, is the judge who sent me away. That was when he gave me the name. The man Daniel Hollis named was Sheriff Cyrus Vance. You have to understand what that name meant in Merrill County. Cyrus Vance had been the law in our county for 30 years. He had been sheriff when I was a young judge. He had stood up at my wife's funeral and said kind words. He had been at my swearing in. He was, in every way that mattered in a small place, the very bones of our community. He had retired about the same time I did, and lived now in a big house at the edge of town, a respected old lion of a man. To accuse Cyrus Vance of murder was like accusing the courthouse itself. That's not possible, I said. Cyrus investigated that case. He testified at your trial. He investigated it, Daniel said, because investigating it was how he controlled it. He was the first man on the scene. He was the man who found my fingerprints right where they needed to be. He was the man who decided which neighbor's story got written down and which got forgotten. Russell Pike was a partner of his, Your Honor. Did you know that? They bought land together. They split the spoils. And Pike was getting greedy. And Pike was keeping books. And those books had things in them that would have ended Cyrus Vance and worse. So Pike had to go. And there I was, a quiet man with a temper everyone knew about, and a debt everyone could see, ready-made to hang it on. You're saying the sheriff killed his own partner and framed you for it? I'm saying, Daniel said slowly, that I saw Cyrus Vance's car at Russell Pike's house that night, after I left. I didn't think anything of it at the time. The sheriff at a businessman's house. What's strange about that? I didn't think anything of it until I was sitting in a cell, and I understood that the man who put me there was the man I'd seen arriving as I drove away. And by then it was my word, a convicted man's word, against the most trusted man in the county. Who do you think they'd have believed? I knew the answer. I had been the answer. They would have believed Cyrus Vance, and I would have believed him too. And the deal, I said. The man who made you disappear, the fake death, that was Cyrus, Daniel said. Not him personally, but his money, his reach. A man like that has favors he can call in inside those walls. When the appeals started looking like they might find something, when my daughter started writing letters to lawyers, Cyrus decided that a dead Daniel Hollis was safer than a live one. So Daniel Hollis died. and the man I became was warned, very clearly, what would happen to my daughter if Daniel Hollis ever came back to life. So I stayed dead. For her. For 18 years. I sat there in that diner booth, and I felt the entire structure of my life rearranging itself. Everything I had believed about that trial, about that town, about the men I had trusted, was sliding sideways. And the worst part, the part that sat in my chest like a stone, was that I had been the instrument. I had read the sentence. Mine was the voice that said the words. Whatever Cyrus Vance had built, he had built it on the foundation of my judgment, and I had given him that foundation freely, certain I was doing right. "Why are you telling me?" I said, "instead of going to the state police, the newspapers? Why me?" "Because a story from a dead man is just a story," Daniel said. "But a doubt from the judge who convicted him, that's something else. You have standing, Your Honor. You have a name people respect. If you say you think the verdict was wrong, people will listen who would never listen to me. I can't clear my name, but you can. You're the only one who can. The same hand that sentenced me is the only hand that can free me. That's why I sent the card to you and nobody else." We talked for 2 more hours. He gave me everything he had. The photograph, a name of a guard, long retired, who had handled the false transfer and who, Daniel believed, might talk now that so much time had passed. The location, marked on a hand-drawn map, of where he had buried the dog all those years ago, in case anyone ever wanted to prove that part of his story had been true all along. And a single page, in his careful, slanted hand, an account of everything, signed and dated, in case he didn't live long enough to tell it again. When we finally stood to go, I didn't know what to say to him. There are no words for the thing I had done to him, however unknowingly. So I said the only true thing I had. "I believed I was doing justice," I said. "I have to tell you that. I didn't cut corners, I didn't ignore a doubt. I looked at what was in front of me, and I judged it as honestly as I knew how. And I was wrong. And I'm sorry isn't enough, but I am sorry." Daniel Hollis looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something I did not expect. He held out his hand. "You looked one more time," he said. "That's all I ever asked. Most men wouldn't have answered the phone. You drove 2 hours to sit with a dead man. That counts for something, Your Honor. Whatever happens now, that counts." I shook his hand. It was thin and cold, and it trembled, and I held it a moment longer than a handshake needs. And then I drove home, 2 hours through the dark, to begin the hardest work of my life, which was to take apart the verdict I had spent 18 years standing behind. I want to tell you it was simple after that. It wasn't. Truth, I have learned, is not a destination you arrive at. It is a thing you have to drag into the light, inch by inch, against the weight of everyone who would rather it stayed buried. I started carefully. I am a judge, even retired, and I know how these things have to be done. I couldn't go shouting accusations at Cyrus Vance. A doubt has to be built like a case, with evidence, with documents, with witnesses, or it's just an old man's regret. So I began where any honest inquiry begins, with the record. I pulled the old case file. As a retired judge, I still had access, courtesy of clerks who'd known me for decades and didn't think twice about an old man wanting to look at one of his own cases. And I read it the way I should have read it 18 years ago. Not as a story already decided, but as a question still open. And once I read it that way, the cracks were everywhere. The fingerprints on the paperweight were Daniel's, yes, but they were old prints, smudged, consistent with a man who'd handled the object many times, not with a man who'd gripped it to swing it. The medical examiner had noted this in passing and no one had followed it. The blood on Daniel's sleeve had been typed, but never fully tested, and the sample I discovered had been logged into evidence and then quietly destroyed 3 years later, per retention policy, though other evidence in the case had been kept. The missing cash had never been found, on Daniel or anywhere else, which made no sense for a man who'd supposedly killed for it and then been arrested an hour later with nowhere to have stashed it. And the neighbor who'd seen Daniel's truck? I found, buried in the file, a first statement, taken the night of the murder, in which she said she'd seen a truck and another car, a big one, official-looking, near the Pike House. By the time she testified, the official-looking car had vanished from her account. Someone had revised her memory between the first statement and the stand, and the man who took both statements was Cyrus Vance. The deeper I dug, the colder I got. Because this was not the messy record of an honest investigation. This was the clean record of a managed one. Every loose thread that might have led away from Daniel had been clipped. Every fact that pointed elsewhere had been smoothed over. It was, I realized, the work of a man who knew exactly what the evidence should look like because he was the one arranging it, and I had been the audience he was arranging it for. I had looked at his careful work and called it the truth. I drove out to where the retired guard lived, the one Daniel had named. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was older than me, living alone in a trailer with a yard full of rusting machinery. He didn't want to talk. Men who've done a thing they're ashamed of never do. But I sat with him on his porch and I told him I wasn't there to put him in trouble. I was there because a dying man wanted his daughter to know the truth, and something in that reached him. He'd had a daughter once too, he said. He understood about daughters. He told me that in 2006, he'd been paid to do something he'd regretted ever since. To process a death that wasn't a death. To put one name on a body that belonged to another man, a man who'd actually died, an indigent inmate with no family to ask questions. To walk Daniel Hollis out a side door under a different name and never speak of it. He'd been paid in cash, and the cash had come through two intermediaries, from a man he never met but whose reach he understood. He'd assumed all these years it was about money, about some debt or some deal. He hadn't known about the murder. He'd just known it was wrong, and he'd done it anyway, because the envelope was thick and his own life was thin. Would you swear to it? I asked him. In a courtroom? Under oath? He looked out at his rusting yard for a long time. I'm an old man, he said. I don't have much left to lose. Maybe it'd do me good to put it down before I go. Yeah, I'd swear to it. Somebody asked me right with the law behind them, I'd swear to it. I drove home with the second piece in my hands. Daniel's word was a story. Marcus Webb's word, sworn and recorded, was evidence. And then I did the thing I'd been avoiding. I went to see Cyrus Vance. I told myself I was going to take his measure, to see his face when I raised the case, to gauge the truth in him, the way I'd gauged 1,000 witnesses from the bench. But the truth is, I went because I needed to know if the man I'd respected for 40 years was the man Daniel Hollis described. I needed to look at him and know. His house was grand for our county, set back behind a long drive, with a porch that wrapped around in a view of the hills. He greeted me like an old friend, surprised and pleased, and poured us both a whiskey. And for a few minutes, we were just two old men who'd run the law in a small place for a long time, remembering the dead and the cases we'd shared. And then I set my glass down and I said, Cyrus, I've been looking at the Hollis case again. I watched his face, and I will tell you the man was good. There was barely a flicker, just the smallest stillness, the kind a hunter recognizes in another hunter. Hollis, he said, like he was reaching for it. The pike business, long time ago. What's got you looking at that? Loose ends, I said. An old man's hobby. The blood evidence that got destroyed. The neighbor's first statement that didn't match her testimony. The cash that never turned up. I watched him as I laid each one down. It bothers me, Cyrus. It's been bothering me for a while. And here's where I saw it. Because Cyrus Vance smiled, a slow, easy smile, and he said, Edward, you're a good man, and you're a lonely man, and lonely men go looking for ghosts. That case was airtight. You tried it yourself. The man was guilty as sin, and he died in prison where he belonged. Leave the dead alone. And then just slightly, almost gently, he added, It'd be a shame for a man with your reputation to spend his last good years chasing a story that'll only make him look foolish. Or worse. People might wonder what you're really after. People talk. It was a threat. Dressed in concern, poured with whiskey, but a threat all the same. And in that moment I knew. Not from evidence, from the oldest instrument any judge has, which is the read of a man's face when he thinks he's still in control. Cyrus Vance had killed Russell Pike, or had him killed, and buried Daniel Hollis under my verdict, and he had slept soundly for 18 years, and he was telling me, old friend to old friend, that I should let him keep sleeping. I finished my whiskey and I thanked him for his time and I drove home, and somewhere on that drive the last of my doubt burned away, and what was left was something harder and clearer than doubt. It was certainty. And certainty, in a man who has spent his life serving the law, is a kind of fire. I won't pretend the months that followed were easy, or quick, or safe. Taking down a man like Cyrus Vance is not a thing you do in an afternoon. I gathered everything. I had Marcus Webb's sworn statement taken properly, with a lawyer present, recorded and witnessed. I had a forensic team, paid for out of my own savings, go to the place on Daniel's map and dig. And they found, 18 years on, the bones of a young dog. Exactly where he'd said, exactly the breed his daughter had spent years documenting. A small thing, a dog. But it was the one part of Daniel's story that everyone had called a lie, and the ground gave it back as the truth. And once one part of a discredited story is proven true, every other part demands to be heard again. I found the records of Pike and Vance's land deals, partnership documents Cyrus thought were long buried, that showed exactly the entanglement Daniel had described and exactly the motive. Pike's records would have ruined Vance. I tracked down Daniel's daughter, who was no longer a frightened girl, but a grown woman of 40 with children of her own, and who wept on the phone when I told her who I was, and wept harder when I told her why I'd called. She had a box, she said, 18 years of letters her father had sent under his false name, careful never to say too much, signed with initials, full of love for a daughter he wasn't allowed to acknowledge as his own. She had kept every one. She had never stopped fighting. She had just been fighting alone, and now she wasn't. And I wrote, I am a judge, and the one true weapon I have ever owned is the written word weighed and ordered toward the truth. I wrote a sworn declaration, as the original trial judge in the matter of the state versus Daniel Hollis, stating that I had reviewed new evidence and had come to believe, to a moral and legal certainty, that the verdict in my own courtroom had been the product of fabricated and manipulated evidence, and that the man convicted was innocent, and that the true perpetrator was a former officer of the law. I attached everything: Marcus Webb's statement, the land records, the forensic report on the dog, the discrepancies in the file, Daniel's signed account, and the photograph of a little girl holding a puppy. A retired judge declaring his own verdict false is not a small thing. It is, I am told, close to unprecedented. It cost me friends. It cost me the comfortable last chapter I might have had, the quiet, respected retirement of a man who'd done his duty and could rest. The morning the story broke, I became, in the eyes of some in Merrill County, a traitor, a senile old fool, a man fouling his own legacy. Cyrus Vance's people called me everything you can imagine, but I found to my surprise that I did not care. Because for the first time in 18 years, I was no longer carrying that man's steady look in the back of my mind. I had set it down. I had looked one more time, and this time I had seen. The case against Cyrus Vance took 2 years to bring. He fought it with everything 30 years of power had given him. But the truth, once it is dragged into the light, has a weight of its own that no amount of money can lift back into the dark. Marcus Webb swore his oath. The land records spoke. The dog's bones, of all things, the dog nobody believed in, became the thread that unraveled the whole tapestry. And Cyrus Vance, 81 years old, was convicted in a courtroom not unlike the one where I had sat in judgment on the man he'd framed. I was there for the verdict. I sat in the back, an old man among the spectators, where once I would have sat on the bench, and when they read it, guilty. Cyrus Vance turned, slowly, and found my face in the crowd, and he gave me a look. Not the steady, knowing look Daniel Hollis had given me 18 years before, a different look. The look of a man who had finally run out of dark to hide in, and I held his eyes, and I did not look away, because I owed it to Daniel to be the one witness who would not flinch. Daniel Hollis lived to see it, just barely. The cancer that was eating him slowed down. The doctors couldn't explain it, as if the body had decided to wait for one last thing. He was officially, legally, exonerated 4 months before he died. The state restored his name. Daniel Hollis, who had been declared a murderer and then declared dead, was declared, at last, an innocent man. His daughter was there when they read it. He held her hand the whole time. I visited him near the end, in a small house his daughter had made for him, where he spent his last weeks with his grandchildren, learning his real name. He was very thin by then, and his voice was almost gone. But his eyes were the same, steady. The eyes that had haunted me for 18 years now looked at me with something I had no right to and could never repay, which was gratitude. "You did it," he whispered. "You did it," I said. "You sent a birthday card. I just answered the phone." He smiled at that. And then he said the last thing he ever said to me. in that careful, quiet way he had. "All those years," he said, "I thought the worst thing in the world was a man with power who does wrong. But I was wrong about that, Your Honor. The worst thing in the world is a good man who looks away. And the best thing, the rarest thing, is a man who finds out he was wrong and turns around. You turned around. Most people, given the chance, they keep walking. You turned around. Thank you for turning around." He died a week later, in his sleep, his daughter beside him, a free man with his own name on his stone. I am 73 now. I think about that case every day, the way I thought about it every day before, but the thinking is different now. It used to be a splinter. Now it is more like a scar, the kind that aches when the weather turns, but reminds you that you survived something, that you came through. People ask me sometimes, the ones who've heard the story, whether I regret the 34 years I spent on the bench, whether knowing I got it so wrong once has poisoned all the rest. And I tell them the truth, which is, no. The law is still the best road we have to the truth. But I have learned that the road is only as good as the men who walk it, and that procedure followed by corrupt hands produces a clean record of a foul thing, and that the most dangerous moment in all of justice is the moment a story becomes neat. Because a neat story is the one nobody looks at twice. I looked away once because the story was neat, and a man lost 18 years, and his daughter lost her father, and a murderer slept easy in a fine house on a hill. I cannot give those years back. There is no court that can return them. But I can tell you this. On my 71st birthday, a dead man asked me to look one more time. And I did. And in the looking, I got back the one thing I thought I had lost forever, which was the right to call myself an honest man. Not a perfect one, not an infallible one. God knows not that, but an honest one. A man who, given the chance, turned around. So if there is a story in your life that everyone says is finished, a verdict everyone says is settled, a thing too neat and too old and too painful to disturb, I would ask you to do the hardest thing I know. Look one more time. The dead are counting on the living to look. And sometimes if you are very lucky and very brave, the looking sets two people free. The one who was wronged and the one who was wrong.